Today is Transfiguration Sunday, where we conclude Epiphany and begin the passage into Lent. During Epiphany, we celebrated the remarkable grace that God gave to the world by choosing to become human. God didn't have to do that. It's pretty cool that he did. And beginning with Ash Wednesday, we turn to contemplating our own mortality. We join Christ in the wilderness where he wrestled with his divinity and what it would cost him. But today, this liturgical pivot point that kicks it off, all this soul wandering, is Jesus' transfiguration on the mountaintop. As you heard Roberta recount Mark's gospel, Jesus was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white. And Moses and Elijah were there with him, which is a pretty big deal. They're kind of the big prophets. And Peter and the disciples are terrified. And Peter doesn't really know what to do, but being Peter, he feels like he just has to say something. And so he asks, "Should I build a house for you?" Now, this surprise mountaintop event, it's a teaser of Jesus' divinity. They'd seen him as a miracle worker, but this is the first time that he is sort of brought forth in a truly, clearly divine way. And so Peter's default to this oddly weird combination of hospitality and sacralization, "Let me build a house for you," is also to say, how can I get you to stay here? How can I enshrine you on this mountaintop? He hadn't fully come into that understanding that Jesus is fundamentally on the move. Jesus is on a mission. And this transfiguration is just a passing moment before something bigger is to happen. At church, Jesus is still on the move today. And our highest calling is not to lock him down in a house or a house of worship, but to join him on the journey. It's itineracy, this thing I've preached to you before. We're supposed to be a people on the move, not just a people gathering in a house. And in doing so, in being on the move with Christ, we might become just a little bit transfigured ourselves, such that the light of Christ shines out through us as grace to a broken world. Last week I invited us to consider the pursuit of inward and outward holiness, which is our essential witness to the gospel. If we've truly had an experience of divine grace, then we cannot help but walk away changed. If you've truly gotten right with God in your heart and soul, if you've been adopted into the holy family, then the evidence will show forth as holiness of heart and life. And I noted in passing that the world will find your dedication to holiness, to attaining some measure of practical divinity, the world will find it shocking. And I find that our epistle reading this week is helpful in explaining that point. For Paul seems to have grasped this as well. And why wouldn't he have? He himself had a radical conversion from the ways of the world to the ways of Christ. Literally knocked him off of his horse. Our gospel is veiled to those who are perishing. The gods of this world have blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of Christ's glory. Now here's the important part, or one important part. When Paul says God of this world or gods of this world, he's speaking metaphorically. And I say that because we just had, from I believe last week, or 2 weeks ago, his treatment of food sacrificed to idols. And Paul declares there that it's okay, actually, now that we've been released from the law, it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols because they're not real gods anyways. In Paul's theological tableau, Yahweh isn't in competition with other lesser divinities. Rather, because of sin, Worldly logic often runs counter to the mandates of holiness. For those who are perishing, the demonstration of otherworldly joy seems absurd. Gratitude in all circumstances comes across as naive. Extravagant generosity seems foolish, and our willingness to lay down our lives in service to others becomes a target for mockery or an opportunity to take advantage of us. In the eyes of the world, joy, gratitude, generosity, service often appears weak. And yet this is precisely how Paul goes on to describe our witness. We do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and ourselves as your slaves. Whose slaves? The world's. To go forth in service to the world. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. What the world perceives as weakness is in fact the walk of faith. Our strength is not our own, but comes from Christ. To put it extremely concisely, the world worships self and is antisocial, whereas we worship Christ and are prosocial. We are for the world, not for ourselves. In Wesleyan Methodism, the attainment of some degree of this shocking holiness is often referred to as perfection. Historically, the idea has caused us a lot of problems. People don't like to talk about perfection, especially not Calvinists. And the preaching of perfection, the possibility of it being holy, as Christ was holy, stirred up a lot of controversy. It led local magistrates to hire mobs to come disrupt Methodist preaching. And one notable occasion, they had a farmer actually herd his cows through the Methodists who were out there in the public square praying, preaching, and singing. It's one of the things that I'm always grateful to remember when we are worshiping in a church like this. It's such a blessing to have a space where we are free to preach the gospel, to gather with each other, to be in fellowship, and be safe. Not everywhere in the world and not everywhere in time has that been the case. Anyways, near to the end of his life, John felt the need to defend this concept, and he wrote a book called A Plain Account of Christian Perfection. It's a very important apologetic. At some point, I think we'll probably want to do a study on it. And in that treatise, he distilled, he gathered up, he concentrated much of what is distinctive about our tradition, which is also to say our understanding of primitive, apostolic, scriptural Christianity. Methodism is, after all, a very dedicated attempt to be real Christians and not simply almost Christians. Christians who really walk the walk and not just talk the talk. Now, in the conclusion of that tract, Wesley wrote that there is such a thing as perfection, for it is again and again mentioned in Scripture, scriptural argumentation. It's not so early as justification, and it's not so late as death. Perfection can happen somewhere in between your salvation and before you die. That was a new and radical claim at the time. It's not an absolute, for absolute perfection belongs to God alone, nor does it make us infallible. We can still screw up. So what is it then? What is this perfection? It is perfect love. This is the essence of it. Perfect love. And its properties, or inseparable fruits, are rejoicing evermore, praying without ceasing, and in everything giving thanks. All All three of those are quotations from the scriptures. Perhaps you're noticing why I focus so often on joy and gratitude. They're listed right here as the inseparable fruits of perfection, of becoming love. What does holiness look like? What does perfection look like? What does being all love look like? Well, at least part of it is this rejoicing evermore, the otherworldly joy. And at least part of it is this in everything giving thanks, in every moment being grateful. But this morning it's really the third one that I want to focus on, praying without ceasing. We're coming up on Lent, and I've been trying to prep us for spiritual disciplines. And if there's one spiritual discipline that stands out as being more important than all the rest, it is probably prayer. In fact, we care about prayer so much that the United Methodist Church considers it a means of grace alongside the sacraments. It is one of those things that we are commanded to do, and we trust, we are convicted that in prayer, God not only meets us, but divine grace flows out into the world. It is a means of experiencing and expanding the grace of God. Now, often, when we talk about prayer, we fixate on verbal expressions of public and private prayer. And certainly, we've already engaged in some of that this morning, and we're going to do more. And yet, the essence of prayer does not really have anything to do with words, although they can be helpful. It certainly isn't just about asking for stuff. Instead, prayer is about cultivating a relationship with God. It's about being in communion with God. And I get that language straight from Wesley himself, right? Prayer is the lifting up of the heart to God. All words of prayer without this are mere hypocrisy. Whenever, therefore, you attempt to pray, see that it is your singular goal. See that it is your singular goal to commune with God, to lift up your heart to Him, to pour out your soul before Him. That's what prayer is. Communion with God, lifting up our hearts, and pouring out our soul. It's about relationship. The goal of prayer isn't to be or sound fancy. It's to be in relationship with God. In my own spiritual life, I never feel so connected to God as when I play the piano. By that, I don't mean when I play for you, no matter how much I like doing that. No, I'm talking about when, in the dead of night, when I'm next door in the parsonage, and yet I feel drawn, compelled to come over here into this sanctuary in the dark with the lights out. Or maybe I'll turn just one of these on. And I'll sit down at the piano and begin to improvise. And at first it may involve certain musical figures that I've written or developed over the years. But as I fall into the experience of it, new sounds begin to emerge. Things I've never written before, things I've never heard before, things that I don't feel even particularly in control of. And I'm trying to describe something indescribable to you. This is my experience, but I hope that you'll hear something in it, right? Is that, to me, it is an experience that feels like I'm having a conversation with God, even though I'm not saying anything with my mouth. It's a moment in which it feels like He begins to guide my hands in a holy duet. And it's in that moment that I absolutely feel, as Wesley said, that I am communing with God, that my heart is full and lifted up, and that my soul is being poured out in love. That's when I really feel like God is with me. Do you have something like that? When was the last time you felt that sort of connection to God? How are you going to prioritize it going forward? How are you going to make more time in your week to have that experience? And importantly, how, when you do have that experience, are you going to carry that encounter, that relationship? How are you going to carry that out into all the other moments of your life, into every other day, into every word you speak, every action you do? How will this experience of your relationship with God, the deep communion and connection with God, how is that going to seep out into everything else that you do? Will you let prayer, communion with God, become the orienting concern of your days? I hope you will. I'll be praying for you. Church, let us become a holy people who rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and give thanks in every situation. For we are blessed to carry the gospel to a broken world. And we've been commissioned to bring forth Christ's light out of our own being, to be channels of God's grace into the world for a perishing people. May it be so. Amen.